Whenever you're ready. How you doing, everybody? You're more than welcome here to one of the more contentious, let's say, areas of Irish history we're going to be looking at tonight. We're going to be looking at Michael Collins and the treaty. Adriana Moura, who will be giving the presentation, is a journalist and writer from Brazil. For the past 7 years, she's been dedicated to studying the history of the Irish Revolution, with a particular focus on the life and work of Michael Collins and how he was seen by his contemporaries. She's written articles for the Facebook page Irish History 1916 through to 23, and she's collaborated with other media such as YouTube channels like my YouTube channel, Easter Rising Stories, where she's featured in numerous documentaries to do with Michael Collins' life and other historical figures of note in the Irish history, and also Canal Paulo Rizzuti in Portuguese. One of the great debates of modern Irish history we're looking at tonight. We've been arguing about it for 100 years. We may be arguing about it for another 100 years. But Michael Collins argued that he had signed the treaty as the alternative to another war. The treaty didn't achieve the Republic, but Collins would argue it gave the freedom to achieve freedom. So you're all very welcome. Sit back and relax. And Adriana, ready to go. All yours.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening from Brazil. Well, my name is Adriana Moura. I'm Brazilian, and this is a subject I've been studying for a while. Michael Collins is the name most often associated with the treaty, despite he not being the only delegation. He wasn't even head of the delegation, but his name is the most associated with the treaty. And I'll try to make an overview of his dealing with the treaty, the way he made the treaty, focusing on the work Collins did. And I will feature mainly 3 points. It means different moments. His choice as delegate, his performance during the negotiations, and his attitude about the treaty after the signing. Just a moment. At the time of the treaty, at the time of the truce, Michael Collins was the name most associated with the war of independence. It is a contemporary association because he was seen as the leader of the murder gang. He is seen as the Irish Pimpernel who was able to escape all the situations. He couldn't be caught. And the commander-in-chief of the Irish Army, as he was called by the press, the most sought after person in the British Empire. So he was made a romantic figure even before the truce. And the reality was much less romantic than that. His main position was as Minister of Finance, which is a very bureaucratic work. And through the war, he also held several posts in the army. He was director of organization, he was adjutant general, and he was finally director of intelligence, which is the role he's most remembered. But the first 2 positions put him in direct contact with all the officers and most fighting people around the country, because these positions were responsible for organizing the brigadiers. So people would look after him to get things done. He got this reputation of getting things done between the fighting men. He was seen as a very effective leader. That brought the beat of the commander-in-chief, because people would go to Dublin and talk to him first, and he would direct them to Bukerry or McMahon, with the person who could solve the problems. But he was the first one who was he was the person who would say, no, you go to that person, you say that thing, and you get what we want. And another source of personal power was his leading position as president of the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. This position made him, as president of the organization, he was seen by the structure of the organization as the president de jure of Ireland. So he was seen as the person who was really the head of government in Ireland. Collins was chosen as one of the 5 delegates against his will. He didn't want to go. He had to be pressed to go. And there was a number of stories of why he didn't want to go. The most often told is that he didn't want to be photographed. He didn't want the British to know how he looked like. But this is a myth. This is often told, but it's a myth. His first public appearance after the truce was in August, so 2 months before he appeared before the British as a delegate, during the first public Dáil sessions after the War of Independence, after the truce. It's the first session of the Dáil since 1919. And the whole press flocked to the Mansion House where the session was being held, because everyone wants to have a glimpse of the Pimpernel, of the myth hero, the love of Ireland, as he was also called by the press. And from that day, all the press would follow him. Anything he would do in public, the British, of course, knew him because he was being photographed. He was part of the liaison team, so he was always in contact with people from the British administration in Ireland. And he was photographed a number of times during this period. He was photographed and filmed at Armagh, in a rally in his constituency of Armagh. And he was photographed and filmed at a rally in St. Enda's in Dublin. And during the Leinster finals, hurling finals in September, all of these were in September. He was photographed with Harry Boland. He threw the Slee attack, and this is long before he was chosen as a delegate. So his appearance was already known. Couldn't be a reason why he didn't want to go. There's another source of confusion in this case, specific case, because right after the truce, a few days after the truce, De Valera went to London to have talks with Lloyd George to define a briefing for the negotiations. What was in negotiation, what wasn't, what was the grounds for negotiation. So he brought a team with him, and Collins wanted to go, but he didn't. De Valera refused to bring him. He kept him informed, but he refused to bring him with him to London. But in September, when Collins was chosen as a delegate, he didn't want to go. So there's some speculation why he wants to go, then he didn't want to go. And it's difficult to say why he changed his mind in this time. But I have a possibility here. The July talks, they were preliminary, and they didn't involve a lot of negotiations. De Valera actually met with Lloyd George alone, and he didn't bring any delegate with him. So Collins' role in this situation would be more consultative. He would advise De Valera about his areas, about what could be done. He wouldn't be sitting and talking, but the official talks, he would be sitting and talking and bringing negotiations. Collins had no experience. Collins had no experience at negotiations. He wasn't seen as someone who had a lot of debating skills, not seen as someone who was very diplomatic. He was short-tempered. He had a different role. He didn't see himself as someone with this kind of political and diplomatic ability. There's a number of reasons that people used to say because as why De Valera chose Collins as a delegate. There's a lot of talk of being jealous of him, of wanting to make him a scapegoat. Since from the preliminary negotiations, it was very clear that a full republic are not in the cards, that an united Ireland was not in the cards. Partition happened a whole year before the treaty was signed. So before the truce even. But an objective analysis shows several factors that are more likely to have influenced the decision. There's a lot of things, of possible factors that made Collins an ideal person to be in the delegation. He was Minister for Finance and was one of the few people in the cabinet to have a good knowledge of finances and economy. This proved to be a very crucial ability to have, a very crucial skill during the negotiations. Besides, Collins was a leader in the army. He was seen as a leader in the army, and he was well respected by most officers. So there was a fear that proved correct that the officers in the field, they would accept well this compromise that would be necessary to achieve peace. So a decision ratified by someone who was well respected would be more likely to be accepted than if there was no one respecting the army in the delegation. Besides, he was president of the IRB, so the de jure president of Ireland, according to the organization. Though an amendment to the constitution by August, I think, 1921 made the organization give allegiance to the Dáils through the Irish cabinet. So, but he was yet president, and this brought him a disproportional influence among the officers, but because most officers in the field were members of the IRB, I think all generals, for example. And there was a fear that is also understandable that if the negotiations came to a term that Collins didn't like, he could use that influence over the army, over the IRB, to go against the settlements. Therefore, including him as a safeguard that what was decided would be not so divisive. And there's one thing that is often understated, is that Collins worked for the British Civil Service in London. So he knew well, he had a good knowledge of the British bureaucracy. That's the same factor that might have influenced the choice of Erskine Childers as a secretary, because he also worked for the British Civil Service. Sorry. There are. Sorry, I skipped the slides. Sorry.
If you want to go back one, hit the up button, I think.
Yes. Sorry, I have a bit of trouble with the mouse here.
No problem.
There were 5 delegates, as I said. The first was Arthur Griffiths, who was Minister for Foreign Affairs. He was chosen head of the delegation. He was very well respected. He was founder of Sinn Féin. He was one of the most well respected voices in the nationalism as a terrorist nationalism. There were Robert Barton, was Minister for Economic Affairs. He was a landowner educated in Oxford. And there was a solicitor, Raymond Duggan, who was he was former director of intelligence work and as a head liaison officer during the truce. And besides Collins, there was also George Gavin Duffy, who was the only one with some diplomatic experience. He was Irish envoy to Paris and Rome between 1919 and 1921. Neither of them had much experience in negotiations. It was the first experience with that kind of negotiation of sorry, I forgot the word. This kind of negotiation of so much importance, so much relevance. And there was also 4 secretaries, Childers and another 3, and several advisors and a whole team of people in the most diverse roles. The delegates were provided by the DOL with credentials that allow them plenipotentiary status. This means they have full powers according to their credentials to negotiate and conclude a treaty or treaties of accommodation with the nations known as British Commonwealth. I'm not reading the text, but it's in the screen for you. So they have full powers to conclude the treaty. To conclude the treaty, you need to sign it. And they are also provided with a set of instructions by the cabinet. The instructions are also on the screen, and they instructed them to refer back to Dublin before any decision was made. A part of it was followed. They were back and forth several times during the negotiations, so the cabinet was kept informed all the time, but it would be made a problem in the crucial moment of the signing. And these instructions will later be construed as if they had no right to sign the treaty without referring back to Dublin. But according to international law, plenipotentiaries, if they don't have their powers restricted by their original credentials, these instructions, these government instructions are internal matter. They are not relevant for international law. So since they had plenipotentiary status, they had the right to sign. The majority of the delegation arrived in London in 8th October 1921. Collins didn't travel with the rest of the delegation. We traveled the next day with his entourage, with several people who would work with him in London. There's several things that are said because he didn't travel with the others. One of them is kind of romantic because he met his future fiancée in this period, but it was more likely to avoid the press, be followed by the press. This division was also shown in their headquarters. Most delegates, 4 delegates besides Collins, the secretaries and typists, they stayed at 22 Hans Place, and Collins and his military staff and his intelligence staff used 15 Cadogan Gardens, which is like 10 minutes away. It's very, very close. These are the pictures of the buildings a few years ago when I was in London. Well, if Collins managed to avoid the press in his arrival, this didn't last long. A few days later, he became a target. In the very next day, there were clouds of reporters outside his place trying to have a glimpse of him again. He was the person who everyone wants to see, everyone wants to talk, or everyone wants to photograph, and everyone trying to get a declaration, anything. No other delegate received the same amount of interest. So he was there talking, chatting, and giving interviews, and the image of the gunman, the mysterious pimpernel of the war independence, was changing from to a romantic hero, the man who was there to represent the Irish. He was made into a romantic hero. The first sitting of the delegations was at Downing Street was on 11th October 1922. It was 5 days shorter of Collins' 31st birthday. There was a concern because some of the British delegates wouldn't shake hands of the gunman Collins, as they saw. And the Irish delegates didn't want to shake hands also with some of the British delegates who are seen as responsible for the Black and Tans in Ireland, especially Hamar Greenwood. So Lloyd George came with a solution. He received the Irish delegates on the outside and shake hands with them, and they entered and sat at the table opposite the British team. Collins was described by Lord Birkenhead's notes as full of physical energy, a quick thinker, a corkman, therefore impetuous and rather excitable, the strongest personality at the party. But not everyone shared this view. Other members of the British side, though he was simple-minded and rude and not very at their level. But they soon discovered that the uncompromising gunman, as they saw, wasn't a much more reasonable person than they thought. He was a practical man. He had a vast knowledge of Irish history. He had a vast knowledge of finances, and he was willing to reach an agreement that worked for both sides. They didn't expect that from him. Over the next 13 days, there were 7 plenary sessions with all the delegates and secretaries. So at least 1 or 2 secretaries from each side at each session. During the plenary sessions, the star of the Irish team was Griffiths. With his knowledge, his brilliant oratory, Collins was shyer. He wasn't very good at small talk. But he impressed the British team with his charm and his quick thinking. After a few sessions they felt that they were dragging these plenary sessions were dragging, and they weren't achieving much. So from 24th October on, they decided to resort to sub-conference. Probably a division in the delegation played a role, because Erskine Childers was seen as a bad influence. He was seen as someone who was informing back to Dublin and bringing back and forth things that were getting on the way of a result. So it's believed that the Griffith and Collins wants to get rid of him. So dividing the delegation among the sub-conference, they would be able to keep Childers off the team at most times. Not all plenary sessions, not all sub-conference, but the ones where they thought they would be he would be problematic, he would bring problems. It was presented at the time as a decision from the British, but several years later, certain notes show that it may have been an idea of the Irish team. There were 24 sessions of the subconference. Collins took part in almost all of them. He was in the subcommittees of defense, finance, trade, observance of the truth, and the most important, on the Ulster question and the status Ireland would achieve through the treaty. There's a myth propagated by one of Collins' biographers that he took the leadership of the organization, the leadership of the delegation informally because of Griffith's health. But there's no factual basis in it, because Griffith was though Collins took a lion's share of the work, Griffith was the second one in the sharing of the work. He was in most subconferences, just not as much as Collins. He was working around the clock also. And a part of it, Collins kept much of his work in shadow. So he was doing the negotiations, he continued his work on finances, intelligence, and gun running. He was behind a gun running in Germany that had ended with some problems. He sent Sean McBride to deal with it, and he managed to bring the guns to Ireland with direct defiance to the truth. So he was working double shift, let's say. And besides the plenary sessions, the subconference, there was also informal meetings, mostly between Griffiths and Lloyd George and Churchill and Michael Collins. All the four together or divided of all the British delegates, Collins bonded better with the Earl of Birkenhead, F.A. Smith. He was forgot the word. He was a lawyer who worked on the case of Roger Casey in 1916. He was a first unionist. He worked for Edward Carson. And Collins and him had a similar personality. They were both athletic, they were flamboyant, they were ruthless, but most of all, they were both realists with a grasp for detail. And they went along well together. It is said that Birkenhead entered Collins' head and won his confidence, but it also worked the other way around, because Birkenhead came from this unionist history. He came to be the fiercest defender of the settlements, even against his former allies in his unionist former allies. The relationship between Collins and Church was more tumultuous. They were deeply different. They had different backgrounds. One was an aristocrat, the other was from a farming background, a peasant background, and one was an imperialist, the other was a nationalist, a Republican. They were very different. They had very different outlooks, but they came to admire each other. And these relationships between Collins and Churchill and Birkenhead, they helped to make settlement easier. During these subconference meetings, Collins, he didn't shine very much in the sorry. He didn't shine very much in the plenary session, sorry. But in the subconference, his attention to detail, his ability to get to the core of the problem in a matter of seconds, made him an asset to the Irish delegation. He was always direct to the point. This is the problem. This is what we need to solve. This is how we can solve it. And he and Griffith had a disadvantage because they had very little formal education, both of them. And Collins tried to compensate it by having classes. He called people who could teach him constitutional law and fiscal policy, that two things he thought were very important during the negotiations. And he was a quick learner, so he was able to surprise his opponents several times with this grasp of technical detail he wasn't supposed to have, because he learned during the negotiations as it goes. So for example, he sent someone to discover what was necessary for Ireland to take international loans. So he discovered that full fiscal autonomy was necessary. That's why he insisted so much that Ireland would have full fiscal autonomy, which no other domain at the time had. Dominion, sorry. Another point where this quick education played a role was in giving a practical form to the external association proposal. That was Davis Burnchild. He proposed that Ireland would be associated to the Commonwealth without being a member. He would be an external member. But no one could make heads or tails of what De Valera was proposing. And they didn't know what he meant to it. In fact, it is, sorry, I got lost, sorry. So Collins, with help of Childers, of all people, he came with an attempt to give a practical form to this external association proposal. He made a memorandum in which he suggests that all dominions of the Commonwealth who should be regarded as independent and associated in equal terms. This is not very different to the present-day status of the members of the Commonwealth. They are all independent. They have the same head of state. Some of them don't, but they are associated. And they are all equal partners with the independent status. But this only happened 10 years later with the Statute of Westminster in 1932, sorry. And at the time, the British weren't ready to consider such a proposal. So Collins' memo is regarded as utopian. And it's ironic that Childers, they had so much, Collins and Griffith had so much problem they saw so badly. Childers was the main partner of Collins in both the matter of full fiscal autonomy and the proposal for the members of the Commonwealth being equal partners. The delegates, as I said, they were back to Dublin several times. It was a 10-hour trip from London to Dublin. They would face this 10-hour trip. One day they would have several meetings, and the next day they would be back. So in 24 hours they would make a 10-hour trip 2 times. And almost every week Collins was back, or other delegates were back, often many of them. And one of the occasions where Collins went back was during the funeral of Tag Barry, who was killed in Ballykinler internment camp. Besides it, the cabinet was also kept informed by letters, by telegrams, by telephone, all the communication media that were possible at the time. And besides the cabinet, Collins kept the IRB also informed of the negotiations, which was probably a breach of confidence, because the negotiations are supposed to be secret. Were supposed to be between the delegates and the cabinet, but he kept the IRB also informed. The main points of contention, which both with the Irish British delegates and between the Irish delegates and the cabinet, were the questions of allegiance to the crown and the Ulster question. The parliament in Belfast opened in June 1921. The partition was made before that, was made by the Government of Ireland Act 1920 in December 1920, so a whole year before the treaty was signed. And the opening of the Belfast Parliament was opened by the King in June 1921. Opened the possibility to negotiate with the Irish for the truce. So the partition rose the truce in a certain sense. So, and the nationalists, they knew that it would be difficult to face the unionists in the north. They were well armed. They had the support of most of the population on the 6 counties. So even the Valera recognized that Ulster should not be coerced into an united Ireland. They would need to negotiate with them. So the question wasn't whether Ireland would be partitioned or not, because it was already partitioned. The question was ensuring essential unity of Ireland. And Collins and Griffith were convinced by the British that the Boundary Commission would grant this unity. But the Boundary Commission would be a commission. Let me explain better. The Ulster would be considered part of Ireland until they opt out after the Free State, the Irish Free State came into being. That would be a year after, 12 months after the signing. So after the Irish Free State came into being, they would have the possibility of opting out of an united Ireland. If they opted out, which they eventually did, there would be a boundary commission to define which areas would belong to the Belfast Parliament, which areas would belong to the Dublin Parliament, to the Irish Free State. So Collins and Griffith were convinced that the Boundary Commission would grant this unity by transferring large territories to the control of Dublin, like Tyrone, Fermanagh, Derry City, Newry, and surrounding areas, South Armagh, and this would make what they call statelet of Northern Ireland unviable. The last time the delegates returned to Dublin was in 3rd December. Most delegates went back to Dublin, and Collins and Tudor stayed behind because they had a couple of meetings about financial matters with the British delegates, and they crossed in the night boat, but the boat collided with a trawler, and they were forced to go back to Holyhead, and Collins helped in the rescue, which collaborated to his heroic image. So they only arrived in Dublin at 15 past 10 in the morning, and for a cabinet meeting scheduled for 11 a.m. Collins was expecting to take part in an IRB meeting that was happening in that morning, but as we arrived late, he had to give his instructions, give what was going on, a copy of the British proposals to a person to bring to the IRB meeting, and then he and Childers rushed to the cabinet meeting. And that was a very acrimonious meeting, with Cahill Bruce saying that the British had selected that man in the sub-conferences. And Robert Barton came to defend them, saying that they had full knowledge and consent of the other delegates to negotiate. So everyone knew what was happening in every sub-conference. And the Valeras told them to go back and press External Association again. She had been rejected several times by the British team. But the formula he puts is not well recorded. The notes of the meeting are very contradictory. Notes from Barton, from the secretary Columna Burhada say something. Notes for Childers say something different. It is not very clear what exactly the Valera said to them that they should do when they went back to London. And the objections were mostly on the oaths of allegiance to the British king. So the Valera came with a formula to give allegiance to the Irish Constitution that was approved by the IRB, and the oath was written at the IRB meeting later. And the clauses on Ulster. And the Valera insists that if they should break on the Ulster question. And according to some witness, the most remarkable thing about Collins during this discussion was his silence. He didn't present much of an opinion. He was probably waiting to know what the IRB was thinking to make a decision. The delegates went back in separate boats, Collins and Griffiths in one, and Barton, Duffy, and Childers in another. And the next day, in 4th December, delegates went to meet the British again to push once more the proposal of external association. And Collins was enraged. He said he wouldn't make it again. It was refused several times. He wouldn't push this again. And he refused to go. And Lloyd George then asked to see him, summoned him to a meeting alone on the next day. And they met during several hours. They made several amendments to the British proposals. And Collins managed to change the oath for the one drafted by De Valera and the IRB, and several concessions in fiscal autonomy and defense, several punctual concessions, but important, like full fiscal autonomy. And the delegates met again later that day, and that's the famous meeting where Lord George met him with an ultimatum of immediate and terrible war. He wrote a letter that Griffiths wrote during after one of the sub-conference meetings, ensuring that he wouldn't break on the Ulster question. The letter had a very different meaning at the time. It was a different context. It was to be presented during a unionist meeting. It wasn't supposed to be used in the contest. It was presented by Lord George, but Griffiths said that he would stand by his words. He wouldn't break in Ulster, and there was a lot of confusion and anger among the Irish delegates, and they retired to discuss the question. And Collins' reaction was anger. Churchill said, wrote later about it. Michael Collins rose looking as if he was going to shoot someone, preferably himself. In all my life, I have never seen so much passion and suffering in his trains. On the way back to Hans Place, Collins was silent in the car at first, but later he very much for the surprise of Barton, he said he was going to sign. He was going to follow Griffiths and he would sign. And Duggan decided right after he would sign again. And the other two, both Gavin Duffy and Barton, said no, they wouldn't. Let's discuss the subject. And Collins returned to Cadogan Gardens, and the other delegates were left to discuss at Hans Place. And he only arrived late. Collins only arrived later, and was observed by Kathleen McKenna, who was one of the secretaries, one of the typists, pushing a chair to see the stairs where they would descend and falling asleep. So the other four delegates decided one by one that they would agree, they would sign. They wouldn't commit themselves to war, as Barton put later. And they went back to Downing Street, and the treaty was signed at 2 a.m. of 6 December 1922. Birkenhead, on rising after signing the treaty, said, I may have signed my political death warrant, of which Collins is supposed to have answered. I may have signed my actual death warrant. And immediately, Duggan left for Dublin with the Irish copy. You can see that this in the screen is the Irish copy, where the Irish signatures are on the left. The British copy was only made later because they didn't think that they need a copy, so it was made later, but Duggan has already departed. So they cropped and pasted his signature from menu. You can see the British copy, you can identify the British copy because the Irish signatures are on the right. And as soon as the delegates came back to Dublin a few days later, because they were summoned for a cabinet meeting. It was De Valera was very angry. Some of the other ministers were very angry. There were a lot of discussion, but the cabinet ended approving the treaty by 4 votes to 3. Cosgrave voted with the delegates who were also ministers. Right after the treaty, Collins started to talk with everyone who could, advocating for the treaty the way he saw it. He said it was a stepping stone for more freedom. They would consolidate the position as they were and would fight for the rest of freedom later from that consolidated position. He wanted to use the treaty to get the British out of Ireland and build the army, the our institution, and building freedom from there until dismounting, using the treaty to dismount the treaty itself. And his influence of the fighting men cannot be overstated. People, he would talk to them, and they would say, "Okay, what's good for me, Collins is good for me." This is an argument that appeared a lot in the treaty debates. What's good for me, Collins is good for me. And a good example is Sean Hayes. Sean Hayes was he was commandant of the Bandol Battalion. He was one of the fiercest fighting men. He was at Crossbarry, at several well-known actions, ambushes, and he was elected TD in 1921 by South Cork, and he left Cork saying, he made a speech saying he would never accept the treaty. Then he arrived in Dublin and had a chat with Collins, and he changed his mind, and he became one of the strongest defenders of the treaty, especially in the South that didn't have many defenders of the treaty. The argument that made him change his mind, as he told a friend, appeared in his intervention during the private sessions of the treaty debates. His intervention, his speech during the public sessions is very short. He basically says only, "I'm going to vote for this treaty." But during the private sessions, he made a very nice speech. He said, "Speaking from the column which I was always with through the battlefields and willing and ready to carry on the fight, but still I look upon that treaty as the best rock from which to jump off for the final accomplishment of the Irish freedom. That morning on the banks of the Shannon, when Sarsfield under Duras signed the treaty with the English king, foolishly enough, when the assistance of French ships and men saved up that channel, he honorably kept his words and they honorably broke it. Well, the day is coming when we will pay that back." This is the same argument Collins used 2 days later in 19th December, when during his main speech during the treaty debates. He spoke on the first day of the public sessions, and he made a long speech. He had notes with him. He had statistics and other stuff with him, but he spoke without them. He only consulted these notes when he needed some information, some precise data. Right in the beginning, he made clear what he thought of the treaty. "I do not recommend it for more than it is. Equally, I do not recommend it for less than it is. In my opinion, it gives us freedom, not the ultimate freedom that all nations desire and develop through, but the freedom to achieve it. So he made it very clear from the beginning, from day one, that he didn't expect the treaty to be a final settlement, but as something that would be from the basis of further freedom, of further advances towards freedom. He also said that the alternative to the treaty was war. The treaty was signed by me not because they held up the alternative of immediate war. I signed it because I would not be one of those to commit the Irish people to war without the Irish people committing themselves to war. So he's saying that he thought that from that freedom, from that peace that would be achieved, if people wanted to keep fighting, he would fight again. But if people didn't want, he wouldn't be the person who say, no, you have to fight. The treaty was approved. The discussions of the treaty debate lasted for almost a month, with a break for Christmas and the New Year. And it was approved by a 7-vote difference, 64 to 57, in 7th January 1922. And Collins, in the last few days, he was desperate to avoid the split, and he made several interventions, asking the deputies from the other side to allow the treaty to be carried over, to accept it, and then go to the opposition, but not to split the parliament, split the public opinion by going against the treaty. It, of course, didn't work. And after the treaty, De Valera resigned, and Collins made a passionate speech asking again for unity. And he said in the end, the president knows how I try to do my best for him. Well, he has exactly the same position in my heart now as he always had. And he reached his hand in the direction of De Valera, and De Valera was about to take it, but Mary McSweeney started to yell a protest, and the moment was lost. With the resignation of De Valera, Griffith was elected as president of the DOL, and he made a promise he would not oversee the transfer of power from the British to the DOL. So he would not dismount the Republic, as they said. So it was left to Collins to take over chairman of the provisional government. He was elected to this post in 16th January 1922. And he took over the same day. He received the handover of Dublin Castle, the surrender of the castle, as he said. It entered history as the surrender of the castle. It was basically him accepting his commission and accepting the castle in the name of the Irish people. And at the same time, he was working hard to try to heal the split that was growing, both in the DOL and the army. And he entered a dangerous game of duplicity. On one hand, he was trying to keep the British satisfied, so they wouldn't consider it a breach of the truce. And on the other hand, he was trying to appease the Republicans, to show them, no, we're not doing everything the British wants from us. We're not going to bring this treaty all through. We have 1 year to think about what we do about these laws. And this is reflected in the project of constitution. He was chairman of the committee that drafted the Free State Constitution. And he didn't take part very often of the meetings, but he outlines what should be in the constitution. For example, freedom of religion and other things. And he said he wanted a constitution that was as Republican as possible. He wanted the oath to be outside the constitution. He didn't want any reference to the treaty. He didn't want any reference to the king. The British, unfortunately, they refused this project. They said, yes, the treaty should be referenced, the oath should be there, the king should be there, So this attempt to appease the Republicans was lost. And right after taking over as chairman of provisional government, Collins started to travel around Ireland rallying for the treaty, both in the Dáil and in public speeches. He tried to make clear for the public the amount of freedom granted by the treaty, what it means for the education of Irish children, what it means for economy, what it means for the ordinary people, to have the British garrison out of Ireland, and how it could be used to achieve more freedom. He made there's a very nice phrase in one of his speeches that there's a test of who won, who was left in possession of the battlefield won, and his point was that the Irish were left with the battlefield, which was Ireland. And he suffered a lot of attacks. He suffered attempts on his life in courts, attempts to disrupt meetings. They fired shots in court during his rally in court in March. They burned the platform somewhere else. They derailed trains in Waterford so people could reach the meeting. There were proclaims of meetings, lots of trouble with people who didn't want to allow him to talk freely to the people. And meanwhile, at the same time, he was dealing with all of these attempts to show the people what the treaty meant, his attempts to avoid splitting in the Dáil, in the army, all the work he was having to do as all the work he was having as chairman of the provisional government, overseeing the transfer of power between departments, between the British and the Irish. He was also trying to deal with the Northern question. He was very worried with the persecution of Catholics in the North that never stopped. According to Roger Macaulay, who was an officer in the Belfast Brigade, the truce lasted only 6 hours in Belfast. So Catholics were being attacked and killed and driven from their house. There were lots of refugees going to the Irish Free State from the north, and he tried to deal with it first with diplomatic means. He met James Craig, who was the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. He met him twice, and they made 2 pacts known as Colin Craig pacts that had some dispositions regarding giving work back to Catholics who had been expelled from jobs and from houses, and stopping violence and disarming the loyalist gangs. And on the other hand, the nationalist side would stop the Belfast boycott, which was going for 2 years, I think, and would stop giving support to military actions in the north. And Collins fulfilled part of his part of the agreement, but not much. He kept sending arms and swapping arms to send the arms he received from the British. He would swap with anti-treaty brigades and send the swapped arms to the north. And he was supporting actions against police forces in the north. There were sub-kidnappings, there were nationalists kidnapped a commission of footballers who was kidnapped. Then he supported or even ordered some policemen to be kidnapped also. So there were lots of troubles. But Craig didn't fulfill any of his part in the settlements. He didn't work with against the spelling of Catholics. No Catholic has received their job back or their houses back. So both pacts were failures. And Collins was so worried about the situation of the Catholics that he commissioned a book called Facts and Figure of the Belfast Pogrom that chronicled the attacks on the North, on the Catholics. He was called Belfast Pogrom. And among these military actions that Collins was supporting, there was to be coordinated attacks with pro and anti-treaty forces in the north. This was a failure because they couldn't coordinate the brigades acting in different moments, but there was a battle in the area of Pettigo and Bellick between, I think, Fermanagh and Donegal. And the British found that Protestant troops were participating in the attacks. So even at the time, there was it wasn't easy for Collins to say, no, I have nothing to do with that, because they were caught held red-handed, First State troops in the north. And after the failure of the campaign, it was urgent to bring the fighting men out of the area because they were being sweeping. And he brought up to 500 Iron men from the north, and they formed a unit that wasn't part of the Free State Army. They regrouped at the Curragh. They received uniforms, they received pay, they received training, and even in the thick of the Civil War, he was still promising them that that needs to be a little patient because he needed to end the Civil War. He was trying a different approach. He was trying the diplomatic approach again. And if these efforts didn't bear fruit, he didn't get what they wanted, he said to them, the treaty can go to hell and we'll start all over. So he never had this northern, even 3 weeks before he was killed, he still had this northern situation right in front of his head. And as you know, all these efforts to avoid the split didn't avoid the worsening of the situation. There was even a pact between the Collins de Valera Pact that allowed an election to be held in June, where the pro-treaty side had a majority. But it didn't prevent it gets worse and worse until it descended to civil war after the attack on Four Courts that was occupied since for over 2 months by anti-treaty force. And then during the Civil War, Collins ended being killed. And after his death, all his efforts to start dismounting the treaty were abandoned by his successors. The Northern unit at the Curragh was forced to disband, and they had 2 options. Either they could return to the north, or they could join the Free State Army. A vast majority joined the Free State Army. A few of them later defected to the anti-treaty side. They believed the treaty as the way Collins was leading, but they didn't believe the way the successors were leading. And the Boundary Commission was eventually neglected, and its findings didn't brought large areas. It was small wars that were to be transferred, and in the end, its findings were disregarded. They decided nothing would change, but in exchange, some debts that were predicted by the treaty were discharged from the Free State. Ironically, it was De Valera who proved Collins was right in saying that the treaty was a stepping stone, because he used very treaty provisions that he criticized so much in 1921 to dismount the treaty itself until Ireland became a republic in all but in name with the 1937 Constitution. Well, I think it's that.
Well done. Well done. That's fantastic, Adriana. I have to say that was an absolutely brilliant and so concise take on the treaty. Now we've loads of questions, okay? So what I'll do is, folks, I'm just going to ask the questions for about half an hour and we'll see how we get along with that. But I'm only just going to ask questions just to keep us focused, okay? So, okay, so let's begin. Now, Adriana, in terms of, let's just see, we have loads of questions. In terms of, by the Dáil accepting the terms of the treaty negotiations, were they already at a disadvantage before they even begun? You know, with the Government of Ireland Act, for example.
Not necessarily a disadvantage, but they had a disadvantage because they didn't have the military strength of the British. So they were at disadvantage long before the truce. They were at disadvantage at the beginning of the war of independence. They were going against all odds from the beginning. So by accepting the terms of the truce, they were accepting there would be no independent republic. This is very clear.
Okay. And how come the Unionists weren't taking part in this? Like the Unionists had already got what they wanted, or?
De Valera wanted the Unionists to take part in the negotiations, like a third part, but they refused. So they didn't want to take part in the negotiations. They were doing their thing, basically ignoring there was negotiations, and the British government couldn't ignore them because they were part of the support basis of the coalition government of Lloyd George. So they were going back and forth, talking to them, we're doing this, we're doing that. But the Irish didn't have a saying, like, we're going to do this now.
Okay. And did Robert Barton want De Valera over near the end of the treaty negotiations? Did anything happen there?
Sorry, could you repeat?
Yeah. Did Robert Barton want De Valera over to negotiate near the end of the treaty negotiations?
Yes. All delegates in one moment or another, they asked De Valera to go. Even Collins and Griff, they wanted De Valera to go. But when Barton asked it in the last meeting of the cabinet before the signing of the treaty, Collins and Griff were against because the negotiation was very advanced. So probably they thought that it would become stalled if De Valera went, and they would have to start all over. Okay. So they were against, and De Valera said no, so I don't go.
Okay. A lot of people criticize De Valera for not going, but other members of the Dáil, like Cathal Brugha or Austin Stack, did they not want to go over?
Yes. Some of the names that were considered involved, Cathal Brugha, who refused, Austin Stack refused. De Valera refused on the grounds, according to what he said, because he was chief of state. He wasn't exactly chief of state. Ireland didn't have a chief of state at the time. Okay. He was, in principle, he was chief of government, but this was an argument he used. His real motive will be probably never known. Okay. But other members of the cabinet refused. One person who wanted to go, but no one wanted her to go, was Mary McSweeney, because they thought she would be a very bad negotiator for any compromise possible.
Okay. And in terms of selling the treaty, wasn't there lots and lots of Republican prisoners released from Ballykinler, Interment Camp and elsewhere? Why didn't they make more of that? selling the treaty to the Dáil?
It was mentioned, the prisoners started in Ireland, started to be released right after the signing of the treaty. Even before it started to be debated in the Dáil, they were already being released. The prisoners in England were only released after the approval by the Dáil, but those in Ireland were already being released. So it was not it was a non-question, because it was already happening. Everyone knew. They didn't have why to discuss this, because it was already happening.
Okay, okay. And why, this is the million-dollar question, I suppose, but why did they sign the treaty without referring back to Dublin? Like, they'd been expressly asked to refer back before signing, but they didn't do so.
Yes, they actually tried to refer back. They telephoned in the middle of the night to Dublin, trying to reach De Valera, but De Valera was in Limerick. And a person in Dublin, Gerard O'Sullivan, phoned Limerick and tried to call him, and he refused to attend the phone. So he didn't know what was happening, because he refused to attend the phone. And they had a pressure to sign right away. They were threatened with immediate war if they didn't sign. So, and they knew they didn't have much room for improvement anymore. So they knew it was basically the last thing they could reach. So they decided to sign.
Okay. And why did Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith allow the treaty articles to be published in British newspapers before the Dáil or the cabinet colleagues in Dublin would know of this? Like, that would be a slap in the face, would it not?
Yes, I don't think they had the same needs. Probably the British team released the articles before reaching Dublin, because it was a 10-hour trip. Duggan left in the first boat on the day, in the first train, in the first boat. But it was 10-hour trip. Okay. So if it was in the papers in the morning, he didn't have time to reach Dublin before that.
Okay.
It was probably the British who released the terms. It was probably not their decision.
Okay. Did the British themselves overplay their hand? Weren't they out of power 6 months later? Did they give away too much, or from their perspective?
Could you repeat, please?
Yeah. Did the British give away too much because weren't they out of power a few months later, or not?
So they were accused of giving up too much. They were really accused. There were not only diehards in Ireland. There were diehards in Britain too, especially the Conservative Party, which was part of the coalition. So it probably helped to damage the image of Lloyd George's government.
Okay. Charles Denny has asked, is there evidence of American interference in treaty negotiations?
No, that I know, there's no evidence.
Okay. And Dermot Buckley has asked, were the Irish side taking stock of Woodrow Wilson? Were the Irish side taking stock of the disinclination of Woodrow Wilson to meet and engage with Irish delegates in the days of the negotiation of the Versailles Treaty? What role did Woodrow Wilson have in terms of, did he have any role in terms of the treaty negotiation? Like, were the English concerned about how the Americans would react to the treaty?
Wilson particular not. When De Valera was in America, he spent 18 months in America during the War of Independence. He tried to be received by Wilson. He tried to influence American politics, and he didn't get much in that sense. He didn't get anything supporting Irish independence from the American government. So Wilson, I think Wilson wasn't willing to annoy his British allies. They were just after winning a war together. I don't think he was very eager to anger them by dealing with the Irish question.
What kind of a profile did the British have on Michael Collins when he went over to negotiate?
After the truce, they got a lot of information they didn't have before. They were getting close to him. Even before the truce, they were getting closer. And after the negotiations, they had a full profile. They had a description, they had photographs, they had behavior, they had hidings. Sure. So they had a full profile of him. If the negotiations broke, he would have to have a very different approach because he was already a public figure. He wasn't before the war, he was after the truce, he became a public figure.
Okay. Mustafa Ketty has asked, with so many trips back to Dublin during the negotiations, was it apparent to the cabinet what the likely outcome would be?
Yes, sure it was, because they discussed the situation. They brought what was being discussed. They brought what the British accepted, what the British didn't accept, what was on cards. What was on cards, they already knew. They knew what the British rejected. So because they kept Dublin informed all along, they didn't hide many cards. They kept the cards open.
Where Mustafa's also asked, was Arthur Griffith and Michael Collins frustrated by De Valera or not in terms of the treaty negotiations?
Yes, I think so, because despite De Valera insisted they had plenipotentiary status, but then he tried to curtail their full powers behind the scenes. He was always trying to interfere in what they were doing, and they saw it as getting on the way of the settlements, and they resented it a lot. And De Valera was also giving support to their rivals in the cabinet, Brewer and Stack, and they felt they were being sort of let down by De Valera. They felt they were not being supported enough.
Okay. Was Michael Collins more focused on Ulster than the rest of those in what would become the Free State government?
Sure. I think no other leader on the Free State or the Republic of Ireland later, no other leader was ever so focused on the North, on solving the Northern situation, on bringing the 6 counties back to the unity of Ireland than Collins. No one did the same amount of work or are willing to go as far. He was willing to use military force, which is unseen after him. No other Irish leader was willing to use physical force to get the 6 counties back.
Okay. Neil Collins Powell has asked, what is your opinion on, remember when De Valera said that Ireland's position would be similar to Cuba? And what is your opinion on that?
I think it's an unfortunate comment he made, because Cuba was pretty much the backyard of the United States. The United States controlled all the political affairs, external affairs of Cuba. And this is the opposite of an independent republic. I think he was unfortunate in the comment. I don't think this is what he meant, but this opened to the interpretation that he would accept dominion status, which was more free, let's say, than the status of Cuba at the time.
Yeah, he caused a lot of trouble in America with that. And like, I think the point Neil is making though is like, you know, is the treaty seen as a better than what De Valera would have seen with Cuba?
I think it was seen by some people as better than to comment. I don't think De Valera wanted to say that. I think he was thinking in terms of being a neutral country, of not getting involved with enemies of the main country, not serving as a platform to attack the country. I think he saw that way. He insisted in Ireland being a neutral country from the beginning of the negotiations.
Okay.
But of course, it can be seen as okay, so we're getting better than De Valera said. Yes, it probably several people saw that way, especially in America.
Okay. You were mentioning before about the north of Ireland, and you mentioned, and I've been reading it at the moment, Facts and Figures at the Belfast program.
Wonderful book, very sad.
It's really interesting. Michael Collins funded this, and what was this book? This was like an expose of what was going on up north.
Yes, he commissioned a priest, I think, to reunite all the attacks on Catholics happening in the north, all the outrage, as he saw, and publishing a book. Right after he was killed, this book was pulped. Only 8 copies survived, and it was read much later, I think in the 1990s.
Okay.
So it was very personal to him, I think.
Yeah. And was De Valera's document number 2 very different to the treaty?
No, it had minor difference, more in terms and in phrasing, and brought, of course, his idea of external association, but it wasn't very different. Most of the I forgot the word. Okay. The provisions of the treaty.
Yeah.
They were there. Ipsis literis.
I see. And
so it wasn't very different.
Okay. You mentioned about De Valera nearly taking Michael Collins' hand before Mary McSweeney gave her 3-hour speech. Could you explain that a little bit more?
De Valera said, after the treaty vote, De Valera said it was his duty to resign, and Collins started to protest right away. De Valera made a very emotional speech. Everyone was crying, and Collins asked to speak, and he said that he expected, he didn't put that vote as a victory, as something to use against the people on the other side, and asked again to work together to make the treaty work. And then he started to talk directly to De Valera about his affection, and he reached his hands, and De Valera was about to take. They were close, I think. They were one across the table, I think. And then people started to talk. De Valera retracted his hand.
Okay. And did De Valera prove Michael Collins right with the stepping stone argument? Because he arguably did that years later, or
yes.
not?
Yes. When Informal was founded and they started to take their seats in the DAO in 1927, De Valera started to study the treaty again. And when they came to power in 1932, he said to someone, the treaty brings much more freedom than I thought. Okay. And the year before, the Statute of Westminster had passed, and the status of the dominions had changed. So he used the treaty and he used the Statute of Westminster to start dismounting the treaty. So he got rid of the Governor General, he got rid of several things, and in the end he made another constitution. He got rid of the oaths, and Ireland became basically a republic, except that it accepted the king as head of state until 1949.
Okay. Okay. Now, in terms of Mustafa, and I'm wondering too, was there a power struggle even within the treaty negotiation team? Like, was there a split during the negotiations already, or was everybody on the same?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it started very soon in the negotiations. Already in the plenary sessions, it was showing a rift between the delegates and the secretaries too. So one of the reasons they went to subconference was because this rift, they felt this rift was disrupting the negotiations. So they wanted to treat it in a more concise manner, with less people taking away people who could interfere in the outcome, I think. So it happening right away.
Okay. I'll just read out some of the comments people have left as well. Liam Shorthall, thank you, Adriana. Stefan Bishop, thank you, Adriana. Tom McGovern, thank you, Adriana. Wonderful presentation. Jerry has said, what a study and delivery. Trish has said, great presentation, Adriana. Thank you so much. Mustafa has said, good point on De Valera not being officially a head of state. Tom McGovern has said he'd no idea about the phone call. Let's see. Thanks, Adriana from Martin. Tom McGovern, as said, Wilson was a huge Anglophile. Okay. Jimbo, was there any consultations with A.E. Russell? And what advice did he give if there was? Do you know of that?
No, I know Collins only met Russell several months later at the house of St. John Galgarty.
Okay. Jerry has said, you know, this presentation doesn't show De Valera in a good light. Des Dalton has said they only would have had to ask Andy Cope about Collins, as he had been meeting Collins since December 1920. Collins was not a mystery to the British. In July, Lloyd George was describing him as a moderate. And Lisa Donoghue has said, thank you, very informative talk. I just want to say just something about Adriana, if this is okay. Adriana has been an absolute godsend in terms of the documentaries that I've been making. And one time down in Bale na Bláth, and you all know that I've made the Bale na Bláth documentary with Adriana and Derek, and we were down, me and Derek, in Bale na Bláth, and we're trying to find a tree that we thought the corner that Sonny O'Neill was on, and we were like, hang on, we'll get in touch with Brazil, got in touch with Adriana. And it was fantastic, some of the insight that you gave us in terms of that. It was incredible. Your contribution to Irish history is fantastic. And I was saying to Liam, if I was to go over to Brazil and do a presentation on a Brazilian revolutionary from 100 years ago in Portuguese, in a second language to me, I would have had such difficulty. You did fantastic. Well done.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. You are all very kind.
Okay, well, we hope to see you again soon. Okay, and thanks a million for a brilliant talk.
Thank you.
Nobody fought. It was unbelievable. Thanks a million. All the best. Bye. Bye, everybody.